So on the top, as we can see here, it says General Counsel of the Department of Defense, Washington, D.C., 20301, September 20th, 1977. Memorandum for the Secretary of Defense. Subject: experimentation programs conducted by the Department of Defense that had CIA sponsorship or participation and that involved the administration to human subjects of drug intended for mind control or behavior modification purposes. On August 8, 1977, you requested that the Office of General Counsel coordinate a search of Department of Defense records to determine the extent of the Department of Defense participation in 3 projects identified by the Director of the Central Intelligence on August 3, 1977, including the administration of drugs to human subjects for mind control or behavior modification purposes. In addition, you requested that the search attempt to identify any other project conducted or participated in by the Department of Defense in which there was any Central Intelligence Agency involved, and which included the administration of drugs to human subjects for mind control or behavior modification purposes. That search was conducted during the period August 15, 1977 through September 15, 1977, and covered the records of the military departments from 1950 to the present. The results of the search indicate that there were 3 such programs in which the Army participated over the period 1969 to 1973. 5 such programs in which the Navy participated over the period 1947 to 1973, and no such programs in which the Air Force participated. In 4 of these 8 programs, the Department of Defense participation was limited to channeling funds to outside contractors in order that the sponsorship of the Central Intelligence Agency be covered. In 2 of the remaining 4 programs, there was no testing on human subjects. 4 of the programs were terminated in the 1950s or early 1960s, and the remainder were terminated in 1973. That's the end of page 1. On to page 2. It appears from the documents that the 3 code word projects of the Central Intelligence Agency, identified by the director in his testimony as basically Department of Defense projects, were, in fact, planned, directed, and controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. Each of these projects and the participation of the military services is described below. 1. Code word projects identified by the Central Intelligence Agency. In testimony on August 3, 1977, before a joint session of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, the Director of the Central Intelligence reported that the Central Intelligence Agency had located a number of boxes of documents consisting largely of financial records relating to experiments using human subjects in which drugs were tested for mind control and behavior modification purposes. The director testified that it appeared that 3 of the projects described by these documents, projects designated MK Search, MK Often, and MK Chickwit, were Department of Defense programs with which the Central Intelligence Agency had some contact. The director also described 3 other projects, designated MK Ultra, MK Delta, and MK Naomi, which were primarily Central Intelligence Agency projects, but which might have had some Department of Defense involvement. It appears from the available documents that these projects cover several subject matters as follows. MK Delta. This was apparently the first project established by the CIA in 1952 for the use of biochemicals in clandestine operations. It may never have been implemented operationally. MK Ultra. This was the successor to Project MK Delta, established in April 1953 and terminating sometime in the late 1960s. probably after 1966. This program considered various means of controlling human behavior. Drugs were only one aspect of this activity. MK Naomi. This project began in the 1950s and was terminated, at least with respect to biological projects, in 1969. This may have been a successor, end of page 2, beginning of page 3. This may have been a successor to Project MK Delta. Its purpose was to stockpile severely incapacitating and lethal materials and to develop gadgetry for the dissemination of these materials. MK Search. This was apparently a successor project to MK Ultra, which began in 1965 and was terminated in 1973. The objective of the project was to develop a capacity to manipulate human behavior in a predictable manner through the use of drugs. MK Chickwit or Chickwit. This was apparently a part of the MK Search program. Its objective was to identify new drug developments in Europe and Asia, and to obtain information and samples. MK Often or Often. This was also apparently a part of the MK Search project. Its objective was to test the behavioral and toxicological effects of certain drugs on animals and humans. Beginning on August 4th, 1977, Army and Navy investigators undertook a search of the boxes of Central Intelligence Agency records, identified by the CIA code words Often and Chickwit, in order to locate documents relevant to possible Department of Defense involvement in these projects. On September 7th, 1977, the agency permitted Department of Defense representatives to search additional boxes containing MKUltra records. Both sets of materials consisted of approvals of advances of funds, vouchers, and accounting records relating to these projects. 2. Army programs. It appears from the available documents that the Army was involved in one aspect of the Central Intelligence Agency project, designated as MK Chickwit, and two aspects of a counterpart project designated as MK Often. The document search is described in Section A below, and each of the Army programs is described in Section B below. A. Records searched. The search of Army records was coordinated by the Director of Staff. The search included the files of the Edgewood, end of page 3, beginning of page 4. Arsenal Research Laboratories, the Dugway Proving Grounds, the Department of Defense Investigative Service with respect to the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, the Department of the Army Inspector General, the Army activity in the U.S. Biological Warfare Programs, and the Army Intelligence Agency. B. Programs identified. Identification of new drugs with behavioral effects. This project began in 1967 and was terminated in 1973. It was carried out primarily by a contractor in California. The project was apparently funded jointly by the Army through Edgewood Arsenal Research Laboratories and the Central Intelligence Agency. The funds contributed by the agency were used by Edgewood for payments to a private contractor. This project was a part of the project designed as MK Chickwit. This project was involved solely with the collections of information. No testing on human subjects was conducted. The Central Intelligence Agency apparently provided $12,084, this in 1967, and $5,000 in 1969 for this project. The extent of the Army's financial contribution to this project is unknown. 2. Databases on evaluation of pharmacological products. This project apparently began in 1968 and was completed by 1971. It was carried out by the Edgewood Arsenal Research Laboratories, The Central Intelligence Agency transferred funds to the Army for this purpose in 1968, 1970, and 1971. This project was a part of the project designed as MK Often. Edgewood created databases for computer use with respect to information on pharmacological products. These included human clinical data obtained from volunteer subjects in other Edgewood projects not connected with the Central Intelligence Agency. End of page 4. Beginning of page 5. This project involved only the transfer of information to computer-usable form. No testing on human subject was conducted. The amount of funding is not known. 3. Determination of clinical effects of a glycolate class chemical. This project began in 1971 and was terminated in 1973. It was carried out by the Edgewood Arsenal Research Laboratories and was funded by Central Intelligence Agency. This project was a part of the project designed as MK Often. It appears from the available documents that Edgewood had been testing a number of incapacitating agents in its own programs without Central Intelligence Agency participation. Edgewood identifies a compound designed as EA number 3167 as particularly effective and tested it on animals. Edgewood also engaged in clinical testing on human volunteers at the Holmesburg State Prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, using prisoners as test subjects, and at the Edgewood laboratories using military personnel as test subjects. It appears that all of the test subjects were volunteers and that stringent medical safeguards and follow-up procedures were used. In 1971, the Central Intelligence Agency reviewed prior Edgewood work and identified EA number 3167 as relevant to the MK Often program. The agency set up a joint effort with Edgewood to pursue further testing of this compound. In 1971, the agency transferred to Edgewood $37,000 for this purpose. Most of the testing under CIA sponsorship was with animals. The primary effort was to determine whether EA number 3167 could be used effectively if applied to the skin through some type of adhesive tape. There was only one experiment that involved human subjects. In June 1973, 2 military volunteers were apparently tested using EA number 3167. The documents do not give any details with respect to these tests. The Navy contributed a similar database to the MK Often project, but it appears from the available documents that the work to create the idea base was undertaken as an independent Navy project not designed for any CIA use, and that there was no transfer of CIA funds to the Navy for this purpose. End of page 5. Beginning of page 6. C. Documents released. The Army has identified 9 documents related to the programs described in Section B. A list identifying those documents is set out in Appendix A. 3. Navy programs. It appears from the available documents that the Navy was not involved in any aspect of the Central Intelligence Agency projects designated MK Search and MK Chickwit. It appears that the Navy did act as a financial intermediary through which the Central Intelligence Agency dealt with an outside contractor that conducted one research effort that was a part of the MK Often project. It also appears that the Navy conducted directly or through contractors 5 programs in which there was Central Intelligence Agency sponsorship or participation, and which included the administration of drugs to human subjects for mind control or behavior modification purposes. The records that were searched are described in Section A below. Each of the projects discovered is described in Section B below. A. Records searched. The Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy coordinated the search of Navy records. The search covered archival material with respect to the activities of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, and the Office of Naval Research. B. Programs identified. synthesis of analogs of certain central nervous system stimulants. This project began in 1971 and was terminated in January 1973. It was performed by a contractor located in Massachusetts The involvement of the Navy was only as a conduit for funds between the contractor and the Central Intelligence Agency. Some of the funding documents identify this project as a part of Project Often. In December 1970, a contractor contacted the Central Intelligence Agency project officer directly and research work on two types of drugs, analogs of DOPA and dopamine, and analogs of picrotoxin. After the work was undertaken, the contractor added a third aspect. End of page 6, beginning of page 7. The study of analogs of the hallucinogen ibogaine. In March 1972, the contractor suggested enlarging the scope of the work to include narcotic antagonists or blocking agents. One document indicates that, quote, the overall objective of these studies is to synthesize new classes of pharmacology active drugs affecting the central nervous system so as to evaluate their modification of man's behavior. Document number CIA-1. The purpose of creating analogs rather than using the parent compounds was to find drugs, quote, which will be more specific in action as well as more reliable, end quote. Document number CIA-2. The Central Intelligence Agency may have transmitted as much as $117,938 for this project to the Office of Naval Research during the period February 26, 1971 through June 23, 1972. The Central Intelligence Agency authorization document stated, quote, this project is funded through the Office of Naval Research. This arrangement protects the agency's association with this area of research and provides the contractor with credible sponsorship. The work will be unclassified, but agency association will be confidential, end quote. Document number CIA-1-3. There is no indication in the documents available to the Navy that human testing was performed by the researchers. One of the documents report, quote, the relative merits of the synthetic compounds will be determined in mice, and information as to the underlying biochemical basis for the observed pharmacological activities will be deduced from the comparative effects of the various compounds, end quote. Document number CIA-8. One of the researchers' progress reports indicates an intention to publish the results of the first phase of this work on analogs of DOPA and dopamine at a professional meeting in the fall of 1972, but there is no indication that the publication was accomplished. Document number N-2. Section 2. Identification of non-additive substitute for codeine. This project began in 1954 and was continued until at least 1964. It was performed at the facilities of another government agency located in Kentucky. The involvement of the Navy was only as a conduit for funds between the Central Intelligence Agency and a researcher who was associated with a federal government agency. One of the funding documents identifies this as a part of MK Pilot. The end of page 7. The beginning of page 8. According to available information to the Navy, the purpose of the project was to find a non-additive substitute for codeine. The work was done at the Additive Research Center, U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, in Lexington, Kentucky. It is unclear from the information available to the Navy whether the researcher was an independent scientist using government facilities or a government employee. It appears that the researcher tested some 800 compounds on addicted patients. There is no indication in the documents as to the number of persons involved or the compounds tested. 3 compounds were retained, and all are now common drugs. Darvon, which is used as a painkiller, dextromethorphan, which is used as a cough syrup, and Lomotil, which is used as an anti-diarrhea drug. The Central Intelligence Agency transferred at least $282,215 to the Office of Naval Research for this program, with instructions to make the funds available to the researcher at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. The project costs appear to have been between $34,000 and $45,000 per year. These documents specify that, quote, the interest of the CIA in this project is classified, secret, and not to be revealed, end quote. E.g., document number N18, Section 3, Identification of Effects of Blast Concussion. This project began in October 1954 and was terminated, at least with respect to the Navy, in December 1955. It was performed by a contractor located in California. This involvement of the Navy was primarily as a conduit of funds from the Central Intelligence Agency to the contractor. A small amount of Navy funds may have also have been used for this contract. In December 1955, this project was terminated as far as the Navy involvement was concerned, and it thereafter apparently became Sub-Project 54 of the MKUltra project. While the Navy was involved with this project, it did not include any drug testing and apparently did not include any testing on humans. The contractor was investigating a new theory of dynamics of brain concussion. Fluid-filled flasks were used to measure the effect of brain impacts from a 2.5-pound charge of dynamite 10 feet away. The results of this work were published in 1957 in a 17-page report entitled, quote, On the Impact Thresholds of Brain Concussion, end quote. Document N19. End of page 8. Beginning of page 9. The Central Intelligence Agency transferred $20,000 to the Office of Naval Research for the use on this project. The Office of Naval Research may have contributed as much as $5,000 of its own funds to this project. In December 1955, the contractor submitted a proposal for a continuation of the research for 1956. In that proposal, a contractor pointed out that brain concussion, quote, is always followed by amnesia for an actual moment of the accident, end quote, and suggested that, quote, if a technique were devised to induce brain concussion without giving either advanced warning or causing external physical trauma, the person upon recovery would be unable to recall what happened to him. Under these conditions, the same technique of producing the concussion could be reused many times without disclosure of its nature, end quote. Document number 4. Document number CIA-4. Correction. In discussing the techniques envisioned, the contractor described non-drug means for inducing concussion, but went on to describe a technique for providing immunity to concussion that, quote, involves introduction of a small quantity of gas, approximately 1 cc, into the spinal cord, end quote. Document number CIA-4. When this project proposal was received, CIA decided to convert it to the MKUltra project rather than using the Navy as a conduit for funds. A memorandum dated January 10, 1956 explained, the first year's work on this program was financed through the Navy for several reasons. When the contractor was cleared and informed of our true interests in this research, the whole scope of the project changed, and it became apparent that developments might be expected in the second year which would make it impossible to operate the program securely under the previous cover. Specifically, human experiments of a type not easily justifiable on medical therapeutic grounds would be involved. For the reasons given above, and because this project in a general way will begin to become involved in the suspects of interrogation and some aspect of brainwashing. End of page 9, beginning of page 10. TSS/CD has decided that it should be funded through Project MKUltra rather than by less secure means. Document number CIA-5. The project thereafter became Subproject 54 of the MKUltra project, and there is no indication of further involvement by the Navy. Section 4. Administration of LSD to human subjects. This project began in 1952 and was apparently completed by 1956. It was performed by a researcher located in New York. Navy is listed as a sponsor in only one CIA document prepared at a later date and not otherwise corroborated. If Navy was involved, it was solely as a conduit for funds between the Central Intelligence Agency and the researcher. This project has been identified as subprojects 7, 27, and 40 of the MKUltra project. Section 5. Development and administration of speech-inducing drugs. This project apparently began in 1947 and ended in 1953. It was performed primarily by a contractor located in New York and, in one aspect, by the Navy at a location in Europe. The involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency was apparently only as an interested observer. The project was funded by the Navy through the Naval Medical Research Institute. The Central Intelligence Agency of this project are apparently in the Bluebird and Artichoke project files. The Navy arranged in 1950 to obtain marijuana and heroin from the FBI for use in experiments and entered a contract with a researcher in New York to develop drugs and instrumentation for use in interrogation of prisoners of war, defectors, and similar persons. The security cover for the project was a study of motion sickness. The study began with 6 of the researchers' staff as knowing volunteers. The project was expanded to cover barbiturates and benzodrine. Other substances were evaluated. In August 1952, the Office of Naval Intelligence informed the Central Intelligence Agency that it had developed drugs that might have the desired characteristics and was about to test them on human subjects who would be unaware of the test. The drugs were administered to about 8 subjects, each of whom was a Soviet defector, and each test was done in Europe. The end of page 10, the beginning of page 11. In September 1952, the tests were apparently not satisfactory because the drugs had such a bitter taste that it was not possible to keep the human subjects from knowing about the test. By September 1952, it was apparent that this project was not producing useful results, and the Navy began to consider ending it. By 1953, most work had apparently been phased out. Section C, documents released. The Navy had identified 42 documents which are related to the programs described in Section B. Section 4, Air Force Programs. It appears from the available documents that the Air Force was not involved in any aspect of the Central Intelligence Agency projects designated as MK Search, MK Often, and MK Chickwit. It also appears that the Air Force was not involved in any programs in which there was Central Intelligence Agency sponsorships or participation, and which included the administration of drugs to human subjects for mind control or behavior modification purposes. Section A. Records searched. The search was conducted by the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Research, Development, and Logistics. The Air Force staff officers in which records were searched are the Surgeon General, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and the Air Force Intelligence Service. Section B. Programs identified. There were no records or information found relating to projects designated MK Search, MK Often, or MK Chickwit, or corresponding to the description of the subject matter of those projects available through the Central Intelligence Agency files. End of page 11. Beginning of page 12. There were no documents or information found indicating any CIA involvement in any experimentation program conducted by the Air Force that included administration of drugs to human subjects. Section C. Documents released. None. Section 6. Current programs. There are no programs currently maintained by any Department of Defense component or contractor involving drug testing on human subjects in which the Central Intelligence Agency is in any way involved. All current Department of Defense programs involving the use of investigational drugs on humans, including its contractor programs, have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The end of page 12. The beginning of page 13. Appendix A. Army documents. 1. Annual report in conjunction with Army Contract DA-18-035-AMC-126-A to Medical Research Laboratory, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, 21010, from During Laboratories, University of Pennsylvania, dated March 31st, 1966. 2. Letter. Subject. Proposed R&D study by Edgewood Arsenal, RD 71-535, to Commanding General, U.S. Army Material Command from Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, Department of the Army, dated 19 March 1971. 3. Distribution Program Funding, Fiscal Year 1971. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland 21010, dated 1st of October 1971. 4. Procurement Work Directive to Commanding Officer, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland 21010. And just for clarification, if you're listening in an audio version, the 21010 is the zip code for the Maryland location. From Commanding General, U.S. Army Munitions Command, Dover, New Jersey, zip code 07801, dated October 8th, 1971. 5. First quarter, FY72, Activity Management Report to Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, Department of the Army, from Headquarters, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, zip code 21010, dated 17th of December, 1971. 6. Memorandum to Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, Department of the Army, from B350 USC 403G, Chief Supply Division, CIA, dated 21st of June, 1972. Subject: extension of contract date. 7. Memorandum to Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics Department of the Army from illegible, I can't read that. Chief of Supply Division, CIA, dated 10th of November 1972. Subject: extension of contract date. 8. Miscellaneous documents dated from 1974 through 1975 pertaining to the funding and testing of a radioactive glycolate in animals. 9. Note from Colonel McClure, Director of Biomedical, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, to Mr. Ed Owens, Biomedical Laboratory, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, dated August 1975. Subject: Agent 3167. The end of page 13. Beginning of page 14. Appendix B. Navy documents. 1. June 16, 1972. Letter from Sheehan Institute for Research, INC, to ONR. 2. June 15, 1972. Letter to ONR. 3. February 17, 1972. ONR procurement request and approval. 4. February 17, 1972. ONR DD Form 1498. 5. March 16, 1972. CNR requisition and invoice shipping document. 6. March 10, 1972. Letter from Sheehan Institute to ONR. 7. March 12, 1971. ONR procurement request and approval. 8. March 12, 1971. ONR DD Form 198. 9. March 12, 1971. ONR Military Relevance Statement. 10. March 1st, 1971. ONR request and invoice shipping document. 11. Undated CIA memorandum to ONR. 12. July 19, 1961. CIA memorandum to ONR. 13. November 7, 1960. CIA memorandum to ONR. 14. October 4th, 1960. CIA memorandum to ONR. 15. September 15th, 1959. CIA memorandum to ONR. 16. July 18th, 1958. CIA memorandum to ONR. 17. August 16th, 1957. CIA memorandum to ONR. 18. Undated CIA memorandum to ONR. 19. May 15th, 1957. Gross Research Laboratories, INC. Report N2-R1 on the impact threshold of brain consciousness. 20. November 2nd, 1954. CIA memorandum to ONR. 21. October 25th, 1954. ONR Pure Procurement Justification. End of page 14. Beginning of page 15. 22. Undated and unsigned memorandum for the Secretary of Defense on Project Chatter. 23. February 9th, 1951. National Naval Medical Center Receipt Form. 24. February 9th, 1951. National Naval Medical Center Receipt Form. 25. February 9th, 1951. Naval Medical Research Receipt. 26. February 9th, 1951. Naval Medical Research Institute Memorandum on Procurement of Certain Drugs. 27. February 15th, 1951. Receipt signed by the Director of Naval Intelligence. 28. February 15th, 1951. Receipt signed by the Director of Naval Intelligence. 29. May 10th, 1951. University of Rochester studies on motion sickness, vestibular function, and the effect of drugs. 30. July 24th, 1951. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. 31. July 26, 1951. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. September 26, 1951. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. 33. October 2nd, 1951. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. 34. Undated memorandum from ONI to CIA. 35. October 27th, 1951. University of Rochester interim report. 36. February 4th, 1952. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. 37. May 1st, 1952. Report of special project relating to the University of Rochester studies unsigned. 38. September 30th, 1952. Navy memorandum for file on Rochester contract. 39. October 28, 1952. Naval Medical Research Institute memorandum. 40. February 26, 1953. Naval Medicine Research Institute memorandum. RDB scientific report. End of page 15. Beginning of page 16. 41. May 16th, 1951. Bureau of Narcotics receipt. 42. Undated ONR memorandum. The end of page 16. The beginning of page 17. Appendix C. CIA documents. 1. August 31st, 1972. Memorandum for the Deputy Director of Science and Technology. 2. December 29th, 1970. CIA card file on organic material synthesis. 3. March 8th, 1972. Memorandum to the Director of Research and Development. 4. December 16th, 1955. Request for support of research. 5. January 10th, 1956. Memorandum for the record. Subject: conversion of project. And that's been blotted out by a tape or something. So, conversion of project blank from ONR cover to MK Ultra. End of page 17. And scrolling back up. And that was my reading of the memorandum for the Secretary of Defense. Well, I'm sorry, this whole entire document from the Executive Services Directorate website. So that's it for this video. Or if you're listening on MP3, that's it for this recording. Thank you for watching and listening.